Hi, Dr. Vince.
Hey, Darryl, it's nice to be here with you today. Thank you.
Look, I'm totally grateful that you're here with all of us. Today, we're going to talk about what it's like for Black men who are either about to be diagnosed, concerned about being diagnosed, or navigating through their treatment journey,
Yeah.
either alone or with families and such. But in a very real sense, not just like throwing out statistics or stuff, but what the day-to-day, challenges or benefits, if there are any, might be. Let's start by what is it that you do and where do you do it and why are you wearing a little hat?
So I'm actually finishing up a 3-year fellowship here at the University of Michigan in urologic oncology. And again, my name is Randy Vince. So, I have in addition to my MD, a master's in bioinformatics and computational medicine. So, that is really my interest. But I always tell people disparities, and specifically racial disparities, are my passion. So
Okay.
that's kind of what got me to this point where I'm at now, specifically around prostate cancer, racial disparities.
Great. So you're well, and you see patients you just came
Yeah,
out of surgery. You were
yeah.
just,
That's why I still got to go outside. Yeah,
yeah.
that's
And that should tell our audience the importance of this topic to doctors like yourself. I mean, not a moment to change clothes or anything. This is a message that's got to be told. Let's start with this. When I or you or anyone in our audience goes to the doctor's office and first time, they're asked, fill in a form.
right, right.
Why are we asking why is somebody concerned about prostate cancer being asked what their race is?
Yeah. So I think, to answer that question, we got to take a historical context. So, traditionally, or historically, should I say, in the past, prostate cancer, as far as aggressiveness, and it's still to this day, it seems to be when Black men present, most of the time it's with later stage disease and with more aggressive disease. And so, as such, it was thought that, it was just this innate biology that if you were of the Black race, that you had this innate biology that made your prostate cancer just that more aggressive specifically compared to people of white race, white men. So that's majority of the reason why when you go to the doctor, if you're seeing someone about screening for, prostate cancer or something along those lines, where they ask you about your race. Even today, I mean, a lot of the literature that's published, it says risk factors for prostate cancer. It'll say family history, it'll say something about obesity, maybe smoking, but then it's always Black race. And, I think one of the things that I'm always very conscientious of, and I constantly trying to push our field forward, is to actually think about this before we start promoting, that being Black just innately means that you're going to form this aggressive prostate cancer. And the reason I say that is because race is a social construct. Like, it was created to separate people. And if we have a social construct, I'm not saying that there aren't small variations that kind of give us our physical traits, but the vast majority of our genomes, our genes, are they identical. And to date, we haven't found anything specific that we can point to and say, aha, that's why Black men form more aggressive prostate cancer. This gene right here is the reason why. And I think, it's time for us to start really doing the heavy lifting to look underneath the hood, so to speak, to all of the different reasons why, like food insecurity, living in violent neighborhoods, poverty, all of these things that can really, environmental exposures can really impact someone's health, to start looking at those things and why that actually influences the gene expression and the development of cancer and things like that.
Right. I mean, there's a germline genes referring to genes we're born with, we inherit. But then there are genomic kind of things that change as a consequence of where we grew up. The impact of our environment is how
Right.
it's usually described. But it's
Yeah.
basically what you eat, what you inhale, what you're running away from, what you're feeling when you see something or somebody, what your home life is like.
Yes.
How many people live in how many people sleep in the same room? you know, and it's not always related to or necessarily related to poverty, you
Right.
know. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I completely agree. And that's called epigenetics. And what ends up happening is over time, based off of your living environment, lived experiences, that could be changes at the genetic level, at the genomic level, that influence how your genes are expressed over time. So again, it's not just poverty, but it does have a big part to do with the exposures you have throughout life, stressors you have throughout life. So all of these things influence health outcomes. And one of the things that I feel like people are talking about now more than ever, especially after last year, is social determinants of health. And so there's a lot of overlap there, right? Because if you look at, like, for instance, Healthy People 2030, which is a government initiative, the 5 pillars that they have for social determinants of health, they all are surrounded around, like, things of financial security, where you live, how where you work, your ability to get to the hospital, have care, like all of these things, food insecurity, they all play a part. And I think it's just now that we started, terming it social determinants of health, but they all have a major impact on our health outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, it might even be more relevant rather than asking race to ask what zip code you're in, or ask that twice,
Yeah.
you know. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so Dr. Nguyen, who is the Cancer Center director down in Virginia Commonwealth, where I did residency, I heard him say one time, it's the ZNA, which is zip code neighborhood association, rather than the DNA that actually is causing so many of these disparities and outcomes that we see. So I think that's a perfect example, and it kind of ties into what you just said.
Let's I like that a lot. So let's talk a bit about the history before, like 3 minutes on like what collectively the urologic world, the medical world has been doing and thinking before you and I started talking. So just level playing field, prostate cancer kills Black men at 2.4 times the rate as white men. More Black men are diagnosed with an advanced stage of prostate cancer than white men. Black men typically are diagnosed at a later age than white men.
Yeah.
But that's right. I mean, that's just basic stuff, I mean, people could quibble, with a little number here or there, but basically we see more men dying, except in a military setting, which we could talk about in a moment, which sort of
Yeah.
devalues everything we're about to say. So for the last 20 years, folks have been financing and funding research on disparity focused on the biology of man, as if, to say there's got to be something going on in Black men that's different than going on in white men. That's the cause for them dying and getting diseased so badly.
Right. Right.
Is that a form of systemic racism?
That's a good question. So I have to give this caveat. I actually just joined the Racial Disparities Working Group for the Prostate Cancer Foundation. And so, I want to say that first and foremost, but, I haven't thought about whether or not that is actually a form of systemic racism or structural racism. I will say this. I do think that there should be a shift in the way that we fund research from trying to identify a biological cause for this disparity. And here's the reason I say this. We know that diversity in medicine is lacking. We know that cancer patients, if they're a Black race, if they see someone of concordant race, they receive higher quality of care. We know that Black patients don't have the same access to care. They're more likely to be uninsured or underinsured. They're more likely to, not receive the standard of care treatment. And so even if, let's say, gene X was identified and said, this is the reason why Black men are more likely to form prostate cancer. Now what? Right? So now what? We still have all of these other issues, which we know impact mortality or prostate cancer outcomes, but we're funding all of this to find gene X, where the funding should be more so around community engagement and outreach. So that way we can close all these other gaps, right? So the diversity in medicine, we can close that gap. When it comes to lack of representation with clinical trials, we can start to close that gap. You know, one thing that I'm constantly reminded of every time I start to do any type of research or write anything or give any talk, there's actually a paper that came out and showed that, you know, it looked at all cancer mortality, and it stretched from back to 1950. And what you see is that these racial disparities back then didn't even exist when it comes to cancer mortality. And then around 1955, and I'm not saying this is causal, but you know, this just kind of illuminates the point I'm trying to make. Around 1955, when the National Cancer Institute actually started a cooperative, and we started the first chemotherapies, and then we had clinical trials just kind of come out the wazoo, what you start to see is those racial disparities balloon. And then we never closed the gap. And so it's, to me, it's saying, okay, well, if we have all of these new technologies, new modalities to treat, to screen, diagnose, and treat cancers of all types, why are these racial disparities continuing? But you know what gap also we haven't, you know, done anything about? The wealth building gap, you know, educational gaps, like all of these things, poverty gap, like all of these things are still in existence. So even though the technology has got better, and even though our ability to do all of these different things related to cancer has got better, we haven't closed. If anything, we made it worse when it comes down to the disparities, because it just ballooned. You know, and so I think that's just kind of a prime example of why I say the things that I say regarding to shifting the focus when it comes to funding and research.
Yeah, and there's so let me hit on this before I forget. The idea that we have all these new shiny new devices. I mean, you were probably just on a robot, I would imagine, or something. Yeah. So I mean, you were playing with a robot to, you know, take out a prostate. That didn't. I mean, that existed perhaps, but I mean, it didn't really come into play until the last 5 or 6 years. It's an opportunity for doctors, hospital administrators, internists, and such, who, innocently or not, may shunt Black men of color towards one kind of treatment and white patients to, you know, the shinier treatment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and we see that in our support groups.
Yes.
We still see open radical prostatectomies being performed in community-based hospitals, for lack of a better term. I mean, does that make sense to you too?
I completely agree with what you just said. And I mean, the thing is, and now granted, we're talking about prostate cancer, but it's not just in prostate cancer. You know, one of my mentees just gave a presentation here at Michigan, and he was looking at the use of what we call partial nephrectomy and small kidney tumors. And what you saw is that if you were poor, if you were Black, that you were less likely to receive this partial nephrectomy, where they go in and just cut out the tumor. Instead, you're more likely to just have your whole kidney removed. And that has downstream health consequences, right? So I completely concur with everything you just said. And it's not just within prostate cancer. Granted, that's where our focus is, but we see it all across medicine.
I want our audience to feel comfortable in knowing that being Black is probably not causal to their current disease. And what's unfortunate is, as we sort of touched on, this idea of screening, Black men should get screened earlier. It's as if like there's something going on there. You know, a lot of research money on disparity is focused on, you know, the body on organic chemistry or stuff that I don't understand. You know, the as opposed to what are the social determinants of the disease, of the outcomes of disease. This it's sort of like, I mean, avoiding the real problem is is toxic in and of itself, but it's also telling Black men there's something different and perhaps wronger than the lighter skinned man sitting next to him or wherever. Right. And you know, as a patient advocacy organization, we want to debunk that message.
Yes. It's funny we're talking about this particular topic because I just got a paper that's going to be published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology. And all we did was we said, okay, out of all of the studies that look at prostate cancer outcomes and compare it by race, how many of these, one, we wanted to look and see, over time, have these studies increased in the number of publications annually? And they did, substantially. And then we just said, okay, well, how many of these studies actually describe race as a social construct, which it is? And then how many of them even acknowledge anything about racism? And what we see is that we're kind of falling flat on our face within research. I think at times within medicine, we kind of feel like we're separate from the rest of society. And, racism doesn't impact medicine, but to be honest, that's far from the case because we're individuals who make up these institutions. I'm here at University of Michigan, and there's several prestigious institutions around the country, but they're made of individuals. And it would be very foolish to think that the individual biases or, deep-seated structural racism don't impact our institutions, because they do. And so if we can't even acknowledge that race is a social construct and that racism is a real thing within the disparities research that we're doing, then how are we going to actually close this gap and solve the problem if we can't acknowledge the problem even exists correctly, should I say?
Yeah. And might a better name or a different name or parallel name for disparities research be racism research?
I think so. I think the one thing that why they caveated racial disparities is because there are other disparities that we do note, which, like for instance, income disparities within cancer treatment. If you're poor and living in a rural area, you might be white, but you're still less likely to, be offered a clinical trial or be on a clinical trial than somebody who is more affluent and white. So, even within race, you still see disparities based off of income and, poverty levels. So I think that's probably the reason why we kind of use those racial disparities, because those other disparities still exist.
So let's talk about just real life, like individual concern. Like, what can the guys who are listening to this do to get past defeat, do better health wise? Because it's, early 2020s, 22 to 2022, 23, 20, nothing's going to change dramatically. Yeah. So obviously sad to say, blah, 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 but it's just not happening, So what can a Black man do?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the goals of my career, actually, is to get out and be able to educate and increase health literacy. Because, to me, I think with that knowledge, there's a certain amount of power in it, because you can now advocate for yourself. So, if I never went into medicine, I wouldn't know anything about prostate cancer screening. So I'll give you an example. My dad died, he was 36 years old. I have no idea whether or not my dad, would have formed prostate cancer, right? And so when it comes down to prostate cancer, I would have never thought to be screened if I didn't come into medicine. And so I think by doing community outreach and engagement, we can actually improve health literacy, which allows patients to advocate for themselves even more. Because, there is some unintended consequences around personal biases and even recommendations, like, the United States Preventative Service Task Force recommendation against PSA screening. There's still a lot of primary care physicians who say, you don't really need that, because of that same recommendation. And so I think, to me, that's the key part right now, because we have to remember that the structures and the organizations need to change. But at the individual level, one of the things I'm constantly doing is giving talks, doing outreach initiatives, because I feel as though if you can get out to the community and just have these very genuine, candid conversations, people gain knowledge from it, and then they can actually learn how to navigate the system better, as well as advocate for themselves. And those things, I think, will help close these gaps that we see.
Well, let's do a little outreach right now. Let's like increase everyone's literacy a bit. So doctors aren't doing, you should ask for a PSA test. I mean, we tell at male, we don't like parse out like black men should do it at this age, white men. We just say everybody should be talking to their doctor about prostate cancer when they turn 40,
Yes.
you know, beginning, middle, and end.
Mhm.
You're 40 years old. Ask, so what about prostate cancer? And diabetes and hypertension and anything else that I should be thinking of. But we're a prostate organization. We're talking, that's our top level thing. We like our prostates. So the doctor says you don't need a PSA. Should you just say, yes, I do? Can you write it up?
I think if you can definitely advocate for it, and if they give you continuous pushback, then you should probably find somebody else, to be honest, because PSA screening is a shared decision process. This is your body as the patient, not the physicians. So if you say, I want to get screened for prostate cancer, and they say, well, it might not be indicated, and you say, no, well, this is something that I really want, then they should do it. And I think it's just as simple as that. It's not a physician decision-making process. It's a shared decision-making process. And ultimately the patient is number one in that shared decision-making process.
One of the cool things of me being in touch with doctors is that they'll share things with me that they may not share with you as a black man. As a white man, a white doctor will say to me, I'm not going to do a DRE on a black, I'm less likely because I know like in advance, he's going to think something bad. I'm doing something bad, whether it's like a racial or historical construct, white man sticking their finger up the butt, or I'm going to, there's the homophobic thing, irregardless of whether the patient is gay to begin with, gay there, or bisexual or on the down low or whatever, the doctors, so he's coming up with both a homophobic and a racist construct. So should black men insist that he have a DRE?
So I think the best way to screen for prostate cancer is a combination of DRE and PSA screening. And so, I tell all my patients that this is the best way to screen for prostate cancer. This is what I recommend you have. And I completely agree. I've heard it plenty of times too. There's a certain hypersexualization of black men for a lot of physicians. And then, they say, well, even when they're diagnosed, they're not going to want to have treatment because they don't want, sex is more important than that cancer treatment, things like that, which is just, there's no data to show that, and it's just not true. So yeah, I think the best way to screen for prostate cancer is a PSA and DRE, and I recommend that all my patients undergo a DRE and a PSA.
Is there a specific number that every man should say, I need to navigate me to a urologist, refer me to a urologist for a biopsy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the reference range for labs varies from lab to lab, but typically if you have a PSA over 4, then you should see a urologist. I think at that point, the elevated PSA deserves to be worked up. Now, granted, that's if you have a life expectancy of greater than 10 years, because that's another thing that we have to make sure we are very conscientious about telling people. If you are 85 years old and you're only expected to live 2 more years, you don't need to undergo PSA screening or prostate cancer screening, because prostate cancer won't impact you in your lifetime.
Yeah, so that leaves my 104-year-old uncle out. So that's good.
Yeah,
we don't have to mess with that with him. But one of the things that my older uncle would say is like, I don't know if I even want to go through treatment if I were 60, because that's going to, most men know the impotence and incontinence are a big deal. And, is this white doctor trying to make me, a black man, impotent?
right.
By encouraging me to, set me on this cascade of hell that's going to ensue if I have a positive biopsy.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that, and this is something else that within the field of urology, we're starting to come to grips with, not all prostate cancer needs to have immediate treatment. And so, but you don't know unless it's caught. So, if someone is diagnosed with a very low risk prostate cancer, then we can just watch it. And so that way we have the ability to intervene if it's needed, but we spare them the treatment-related side effects, which we know, that impacts patients' quality of life. And we recently just did a two-part series. And, I gave a talk about prostate cancer, gave a background, the screening around it, talked about some of the disparities, talked about treatment. But to me, it was really important to have, one of our colleagues here at the University of Michigan come and talk about the sexual side effects of prostate cancer treatment, how we can, the different therapies that are available to us to help. It won't erase it and mitigate it completely, but it can actually help improve the quality of life of patients, improve their function in the long term. And so I think also within urology, we have to do a better job of kind of a combined approach, because it's about more than just cancer control. It's about cancer control so we can extend our patients' life, but we also want to make sure they have a good quality of life at the same time.
So, and still on the theme of increasing our audience's health literacy, and even if you guys know this stuff already, there's probably, if we're going to mention 10 things, there's probably one thing that will be a revelation. So let's stick here. The idea that you got a black man going in that gets Gleason 6, has a PSA 4.2 or whatever, 65 years old, otherwise in good health, and he's going to live forever. But his doctor is telling him, for most people, I'd say active surveillance, but you're a black man. And I've read that black men are more likely to die from prostate cancer than white men. I don't think you should do active surveillance. What should?
Yeah. And I've actually heard that before, and I think that's an incorrect way of approaching the situation. I'll just say that. I could put it in harsher terms, but I'll leave it at that. I don't think that anyone should have, a specific management option withdrawn from them because of their race. So, I think while there has been some data that show that Black men are more likely to be lost to follow-up on active surveillance, there's no data that shows, on active surveillance that long-term Black men, if they're on active surveillance, are more likely to die from prostate cancer than white men. So I would not accept that recommendation from the physician if I was the patient.
Right. The patients should step up and say, yeah. And
Sorry, I mean, cut you off. I think that just kind of goes to the health literacy part, right? Because you can't advocate for yourself if you don't know that information. And so that's why I'm constantly telling folks, like, look, even if you are diagnosed with prostate cancer, active surveillance is a management option for you, depending on the risk of your disease.
Yeah, and everybody watching this should download Prostate Cancer While Black. Hopefully version 2 will be up shortly, which will include more of that. But there's a little pitch there from our nonprofits. But should Black men seek out Black doctors over white doctors?
Man, I won't say definitely yes, but I think some of the data that shows that the level or the quality of care that, Black men receive or Black patients receive with a race concordant physician, it kind of makes me want to say you should, but I don't want to just kind of say with one broad swoop that everybody that is of a different race can't give you high level quality care, because that's not true. I think at the baseline, you should just find a physician that you sincerely feel has your best interest at heart. And you can tell, because they'll take the time to talk to you. They'll take the time to explain everything. If you walk out of a urologist's office or any physician's office and they saw you for a specific problem and you can't explain that problem to your family members when you leave, can't explain the different options that you have for management of that problem after you leave, then they probably didn't really invest in you, because part of being a physician is investing in your patient's knowledge so that way they can adjust their health routines, adjust their health practices, their lifestyle, things like that. So, if you feel as though you don't understand anything and they just kind of talked over you, then maybe you should see somebody else.
Can you eat your way out of prostate cancer?
I don't think so. I think overall being healthy is a good thing, but I haven't seen any data that shows, that you can just maintain a certain diet and it'll completely prevent prostate cancer. But I think overall maintaining a healthy lifestyle is very important. So I'll always advocate for that.
All right. Should you move out of a polluted city?
Again,
Yeah.
there's no data that we've seen, but then there's also haven't been much in the way of research to look at environmental exposures and the link to prostate cancer either.
Yeah. There's the Agent Orange thing, which we could talk about, but certainly impact a bit, or not a bit. Let me take that back. Obviously, the idea of listening to Dr. Google, Googling things, trying to take care of yourself, with the idea that, okay, I'm being told, as a Black man, I'm being told to advocate for myself and increase my health literacy, which is to say, read everything I can, try to understand as best I can, chat other friends, maybe form a reading group. I mean, probably 1 in a million guys are going to do that, but, it's a good idea, but, I'm not going to do it. It's just, we just don't have the, all these idealized kind of things, they look wonderful on Netflix, but not in real life, So the idea of, I'm going to be the best, I'm going to take care of myself so much that I'm going to go on Google and prove my doctor doesn't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't recommend that, just because, and it's kind of funny because I was just having a conversation with my sister about this. Anybody can put anything online. And so, you have to go to a reputable source. And so, if you can find information on a reputable source, then yes, you can educate yourself with that information. But absolutely stay away from misinformation, which can be hard to do sometimes online.
Right. Which is why you went to grad school and med school and, got more masters. And, I think most critically, once you got all that knowledge, you're actually practicing nonstop pretty much,
Right.
just like most surgeons and oncologists. The workday that, an oncologist and surgeon like yourself has is truly unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's not just digging into people's bodies, it's charting, it's reading, it's understanding and talking with patients and getting to know them and such.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The so patients now are in advanced stage. So I'm a Black man in an advanced stage, and I'm going to be offered enzalutamide, apalutamide, blah, 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 and, a litany of molecules and multisyllable medications and
Yeah.
therapies and radiation and this and that.
Mhm.
But I know all of that stuff has only been tested on mostly white people in the United States. How do I know? Why is it going to work on me?
Right. Yeah. So that's a good point. I think one of my mentors, Dan Spratt, he highlighted this in an article that he published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, and the vast majority of those studies to approve those, those medications, those novel agents that you just mentioned, didn't include many black men. But I think at this point, we just want to make sure that all patients can receive the highest quality of care. Do we need to increase representation in clinical trials? Absolutely. But I think if you are a Black man with advanced stage prostate cancer, you want to receive the highest quality of care and, the standard of care. And so I think that's the most important thing at this point.
And you and I agree, increase representation, and as an organization, we make efforts around that. We even
Right.
have publications and this, so we work on that.
Mhm.
But does that mean we're being either paradoxical or hypocritical by saying, on one hand, we don't think there's like a biological kind of thing for disparity, but on the other hand, we don't want clinical trials to illustrate disparity, or to be to have just an all-white clinical trial,
Mhm.
because it may not be applicable to Black men and other men of color.
Right, right. So I think, that kind of gets to a concept of when people will ask me, they say, okay, well, I'm doing this disparities research. Should I just not use race at all? And I say no. I think you should, but you should clarify why you're using race. And the thing is, we still live in a very segregated country. We still live in communities where, if you are Black or Hispanic, or, of certain origins, then you're more likely to live in certain environments. And so for that reason alone, I think, that should be representation across the board. But also, I don't think that, by increasing that representation, look at how different communities of people respond to medications, right? Because within those communities, you're going to have a diverse group or diverse representation when it comes to other comorbidities, and so, diabetes, hypertension, whatever it may be, obesity. So all of those things, should be included. And so, I think any researcher would say the more diverse your cohort can be, the better the outcomes. And so I think the same thing is applicable for our clinical trials. And it doesn't mean that, we're trying to say that there's a biological consequence to a social construct. I don't think that at all. I think, it just helps make our research that much more stronger.
We'll just ask a couple more questions, just go another few minutes, because if we were in real life, our audience would be hungry now. And Malecare has when we do conferences, we have the best food of any organization on earth. And
I'm looking forward to coming when COVID.
Absolutely, and you could ask any of your colleagues who've been to. I mean, we feed people well. So the idea of everything we've said, I mean, all of that sort of disappears in a military setting. Why is that?
I think, because so a lot of the VA studies that we show that kind of, when patients have the closest thing to equal access of care, that we notice that, those disparities don't exist anymore. And again, it just kind of reinforces everything we just talked about, when it comes to all of these other societal ills and societal injustices that we know exist, trying to think that, the medical or the health disparities, the racial disparities we see in healthcare are completely absent of those societal ills is just kind of, it's not the right way to think about it. I'd say it that way. And so within the VA, what you see is, and again, I'm not trying to say that that is absolutely equal access to care, but it's the closest thing we have to it. Because if you are a veteran and you are honorably discharged, then you are entitled to this health care. And so if you take advantage of it, you're getting the same access to treatment that everyone else is. And so I think that's the reason why, because we don't have that within the rest of society. Everyone doesn't have equal access to a primary care physician. Minorities are more likely to use the emergency room as their primary care physician. So I'm not going to the hospital unless I feel something is wrong with me, right? I have family members and friends who are, have unfortunately have been in that mindset that I had to talk out of it, because I don't feel like anything's wrong with me. So why should I go to the doctors? I don't even trust the doctors, one. And then I'm gonna have to pay all this money, right? Which is the case in the VA system. So that's why I think you can see a lot of those disparities kind of dissipate when we talk about the VA system and prostate cancer outcomes.
Yeah, and not just the VA, but active duty guys too.
Yeah, that's right.
And as I understand it, with TRICARE, I think that's, I mean, guys could actually get treated on active military bases, and experience that for themselves. Are these still hopeless years, or is it just like Black men in the United States can rev up their, what we're calling health literacy, which is basically get to know your prostate stuff and get to know what it means to be involved in medical care? And would that go a long way towards evening, yeah, I guess that's right, the playing field?
Yeah, so I don't think so. I agree. Like, anyone who says so, when we still have a set of laws, structures, policies that are supporting racism. They're just not as explicit about it. And so they still exist. So I don't think that we should think that that's just a thing of the past, because it's very current and it has current, even the past has current day implications. I wouldn't say that these next years are hopeless years, but I think one of the things that I've kind of been putting on my back and kind of preaching from the mountaintop, so to speak, is trying to get people to realize, like, look, this isn't a thing of the past. This is a current day issue. And unless we as individuals decide that this is important and that we want to start doing the heavy lifting, then we will continue to see the current trends that we had. And so that's trying to motivate people to realize, like, okay, just because this issue might not be proximal to you as a white man does not mean that it's not important, right? So it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And I think as over time, as more and more people start to come to that realization, then we have more people on board and we can start to impact those structures. But, I also think it's multifaceted. So not only just impacting the structures, but impacting individuals to take ownership of their healthcare, their health in general, and as far as their lifestyle, as far as their interactions with physicians, and all of that just starts through education and literacy, I think.
Dr. Vince, thank you for taking time to speak with us. An extraordinary conversation. Thank you for the care that patients and the example, so to speak, that you're setting for your colleagues and your students as well, and the interns around you. So thank you for that, and welcome to our conference.
Thank you, Darryl.